But so that's just so you know where we're headed. And the other thing I'm going to try to do is, you know, I take the opportunity to deliver these lectures as an opportunity to have a conversation with a very large number of people. Because a good lecture is actually a conversation, because you should pay attention to the people in the audience while you're talking to make sure that they're on board and that everyone's going in the same direction. And that's a dialogue, even if some of it's nonverbal. But also to push my thinking beyond where I've already got. And so I'm not telling you things that I already know. You know, I'm going to rely on things that I think I know, but I'm trying to weave them into something new so that I can push it just a little bit farther, and that way I can keep my thought developing. And that makes a good lecture, because there's something alive about that, right? Because I'm not out here to deliver a talk. You know, I'm not delivering a talk to an audience. I'm trying to learn some things about the things that I think are the most important. And I'm trying to do that in real time along with all of you. And so that's the plan. And so and then maybe I can walk away from this event tonight a little more clear-headed than I walked in. And that would be a good thing. So the first rule I'm going to talk about is Rule 7. And that rule is, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And I like that rule because I think that, like, there's a great question in our culture about whether or not the experience of meaning, or the reality, or the experience of meaning, let's say, whether or not that's real. You know, it's not that obvious to figure out, it's not that easy to figure out what's real. You know, we're bound and determined that material reality is the most real. At least that's what we claim formally, and we've probably claimed that formally since we constructed the scientific method formally about 500 years ago. And we believe that so firmly that it seems self-evident. To some degree, it is self-evident. I mean, there's something pretty real about material reality, you know, and you mess with it at your peril. And our mastery of it, from a technical perspective, has made us incomparably powerful. And increasingly so, and it has improved our lives immeasurably as well. And so you don't want to casually denigrate the materialistic philosophy, but just because that's a good way of looking at the world doesn't mean it's the only way of looking at the world. It also doesn't mean it's the best way of looking at the world. And it's also actually not how people look at the world. It's just how they think they look at the world. And that's a very different thing. The way that people seem to act in the world is as if the experience of meaning is the most real thing. And I think you can see that most particularly in people's responses to pain. Because pain is a form of meaning, right? It's a subjective experience, it's an emotional experience. It's not self-evidently material because it has that subjective element, but it's a very rare person that doesn't act as if they believe their pain is real. And so, that's an interesting fact to me, because if you're nihilistic and you believe that life has no meaning, that isn't going to help you argue yourself out of your pain. And so even if you're a nihilist, you believe in the reality of suffering. And that's something, you know, it actually grounds you. To realize that actually grounds you. It's like, well, okay, there's something that I can take seriously. Even in my doubt and my despair, I can take the fact that misery genuinely exists. I can take that seriously. And that's actually a hell of a fine starting point. You know, Descartes, the philosopher, when he was looking for a place to stand, let's say, he underwent a process that he described as radical doubt. He tried to doubt everything he could possibly doubt, and he ended up only being able to not doubt one thing, which was that he existed as the person who doubted. He couldn't doubt the existence of his own consciousness. And that's where the famous line, I think, therefore I am, came from. And he didn't really mean I think. He meant more like I perceive or my experience exists or something like that. That's something I can't doubt. Nietzsche actually did a pretty good job of taking that argument apart. But I'm not going to go into that at the moment. Because it seems self-evident, but it's not so self-evident. You can't criticize that. that fundamental axiom with quite a bit of success. And I did something that was similar, although I didn't know it at the time, because I was looking for something that I couldn't doubt. I didn't really care what it was, but it was like I was looking for bedrock on which I could stand. And for me, it didn't end up being, I think, therefore I am. It wasn't even the reality of my consciousness, which is where Descartes ended up. It was the reality of pain. I thought, well, that's the one thing I cannot deny, that suffering exists and is real, mine and that of other people. And that's pretty pessimistic in some sense, you know, if you think, well, the fundamental reality is suffering. But I also learned at approximately the same time that was pretty standard high-level religious claim, that life was suffering. It's a fundamental Buddhist claim. It's implicit in Judaism, obviously, because the history of the Jews is a history of, in some sense, of unbroken suffering. It's clearly present in Christianity because, of course, the central figure of Christianity is someone who's nailed to a cross, tortured to death, and dies, you know, in an incredibly painful manner. So even if it's not explicitly laid out that the fundamental reality of life is suffering, it's sort of right there as an image for you to contemplate. So and you know, you think, well, that's a very pessimistic way of looking at the world, and that might be true, but it might not be, because obviously the fact that there's a pessimistic fact is pessimistic. But the fact that you can admit to that fact, that's not necessarily so pessimistic. You know, imagine that you're afraid of something. That's not hard to imagine. But then imagine that you can notice you're afraid and you can come to terms with it. What that means immediately is that no matter how large the fear is, that there's something in you that can recognize that and then conceivably transcend it. And one of the things that I learned about understanding the reality of both tragedy and malevolence, because I think those two things together make up suffering. And tragedy is the fact that you're prone to illness and old age, and you know, all the ills of the flesh, let's say. And malevolence, of course, is that there's always someone around who's willing to make it a lot worse than it has to be, and that might even be you. And that's a fundamental reality of human existence. So, but simultaneously, there's that capacity to observe that and contend with it, and then start to work in a forward-looking manner despite that. And so the second thing I realized I would say, after I was willing to put forward that as a fundamental proposition, that the ineradicable reality of life is suffering, is that, wait a second, that is not the most fundamental truth. The most fundamental truth is that people are capable of transcending that. And so that takes the thing that's most pessimistic and turns it into, perversely, strangely, paradoxically, immediately turns it into something that's almost unbelievably optimistic, because you can't imagine how you could possibly give people more credit than to say, well, look, the most terrible thing you could imagine happens to be true. Life is limited, and we're all tormented by malevolence. It's fundamentally true. But if we admit to that, and face it forthrightly, then we can transcend it. And you know, you might think, well, what's your evidence for that? Well, I would say the evidence for that is actually overwhelming. The first thing is, well, you're all here, you know. I mean, despite the fact that the fundamental conditions of your life, in some sense, are quite brutal, you get yourself out of bed in the morning, and you go do your difficult jobs, and you take care of your families, and you exist in the world despite its limitations. And even more importantly, and this is something I'll return to, and this is also something very much worth thinking, is that, you know, you have relations with people around you, and some of them you actually love, and that's a strange thing, because those people that you love, their lives are characterized by limitation, and they're flawed, and maybe they're even tainted by a certain amount of malevolence. And your judgment, because you do care for them, is that despite all that, it's worthwhile that they're around. Because that's actually the judgment that you make when you actually care for someone, right? You think, well, you don't exactly care for them despite their limitations, really. You actually care for them in large part because of their limitations, which is a strange thing, because when you love someone, then Your idiosyncrasies and limitations and weaknesses are all part of that package. It's not like you don't think that maybe they could use some improvement, you know what I mean? But still, the overall judgment, when you love someone, the overall judgment is that all things considered, it's better that they exist than that they don't exist. And that's, seriously, and that's, I really realized that, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I really realized that when I was thinking about my son, when he was a little kid, because he was, but, when you have a little kid, especially when kids are around, I would say, well, when they're under 3, they're pretty damn fragile, and, well, they're resilient in some ways, but they're, they don't know what the hell they're doing, and there's lots of things out there that can hurt them, and so you have to be awake to make sure that, nothing terrible happens to them, and, that they're not bullied too much by other children, or their own siblings, or their parents for that matter, that they don't hurt themselves when they're trying to learn how to operate in the world and all of that. They're characterized by this terrible vulnerability, and it's kind of brutal, their vulnerability, because they can be hurt. And you really see that if a kid gets sick, right? Because I don't know if there isn't really much worse that can happen to you, I don't think, except maybe to be the sick child, him or herself. There isn't much worse that can happen to you in your life than to have a child who's really ill. That's rough. And I mean, there's lots of terrible things that can happen to you, and maybe that's not the worst, but it's definitely like up there in the top 10. It's rough. And then you think, well, wouldn't it be better if your child just didn't ever have anything wrong with it? And then you think, well, what would you have to do in order to make that the case? So that all that vulnerability that's painful disappeared. Well, first of all, they wouldn't be 3 years old anymore, I can tell you that, right? Because, well, you're a lot more capable of taking care of yourself when you're 40, let's say. And so then, poof, your 3-year-old disappears, and poof, he's 40 right then and there. That's a bunch of vulnerabilities gone. And then, maybe you don't even necessarily want him to be human. Maybe you want him to be like 20 feet tall with a robotic exoskeleton, something like that, superhuman intelligence, right? And replaceable parts. It's like, well, that removes a lot more vulnerability, but there's not much left of your son by that point, right? You just replaced him with a battle robot, And there are people working hard to replace human beings with battle robots, so it's not quite as comical as you might think. God only knows what kind of dream is driving that, and I'm really serious about that, because we're moving very rapidly into an era of artificial intelligence and robotics, and God only knows what we're up to with that, and it might be part of the dream that we would have to replace our vulnerable self with something that cannot be hurt, and that would mean we would not be anymore, right? Whatever we would replace ourselves with would supplant us, and whatever we are would disappear. And with all the misery in the world, I suppose you could make a case that maybe that's not for the worst, but I think that's a bad argument. And so what that means is that we have to accept a certain amount of the vulnerability we have as part and parcel of the price we pay for existence. And you might think, well, is it worth it? And I think, again, the answer to that is, well, look at how you respond to a little kid. I think, despite the fact of that person's ultimate fragility, painful fragility in some sense, you're pretty damn happy that they're around in their current form. And so that's something that's very much worth thinking about as far as I'm concerned. So back to meaning. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how the brain works. And it's the brain structure is a lot stranger than you think. And the more you study it, the stranger it gets, partly because we don't understand the relationship between consciousness and its material substrate. We don't really understand that at all. And scientists have been hitting the science of consciousness pretty hard for about 30 years now, since it became somewhat respectable as a domain of study. And I would say we really made a hell of a lot of progress. There's something about consciousness that's an intractable mystery. Not only its existence, but its relationship to its material substrate. And so that's interesting and peculiar. But it's also interesting and peculiar that your brain, like the brain of most animals, is bifurcated, right? You have 2 hemispheres, not 1. And that's a really fundamental division. And it didn't arise with human beings. It arose long before we were around. So if you follow the logic of evolutionary biology, It reflects a duality that's built into reality itself. If you make the assumption that reality is what does the selection in the course of natural selection, and what is selected is a reflection of reality, which is like a Darwinian truism, essentially. You can't really be a Darwinian and deny any of that. Then it appears that reality has two components to it. And I make a case, it's an implicit case, mostly in 12 Rules for Life, that duality can be mapped out using the language of chaos and order. Yin and yang, if you think about it from the Taoist perspective, that it's most, the idea that the world is made out of chaos and order, which I think is a nice way of conceptualizing that duality, is actually more real than almost any other idea. And so, and you say, well, what's your proof of that? I would say, well, the proof of that is the fact that that's how your brain is structured. And not just your brain, also animals' brains. So it's deeper than just human. And your left hemisphere, this is an oversimplification because people are differently lateralized, but this is true in the general case. Your left hemisphere is specialized for operation in territory that you explore and understand. And it's sort of a totalitarian hemisphere in some sense. It's always trying to impose its current models on the world without having to change them. And you don't want to change the model all the time because it's just too cognitively effortful. And so you're going to take shortcuts to preserve it if you can, because you put a lot of work into your damn model. You're not going to throw the thing away the first time it makes a mistake. But it does make you kind of pig-headed and unable to admit to or even see your own errors. And that seems to be a left hemisphere function. It's primarily associated with articulated speech and operation in the known, in explored territory. Now, if you think about the tribal landscape, you might think, well, how was the world constituted for much of our evolutionary history? You can kind of think of it this way, is that there was a fire in the center of things, because we've been hanging around campfires for something on the order of 2 million years, and the campfire kept the darkness at bay, right? And all the terrible things that lived in the darkness that were more than happy to eat you. And so there was the fire as the center and the place that the fire shone light on, and then there was the dark perimeter beyond that where the predators lived. And you could go out into the dark perimeter, you could hunt, and you could bring back something of value, but it was a very dangerous thing to do. And so that was really the landscape of human beings. It's the home base, that's you, it's your family, it's your tribe. And then there's the periphery that surrounds that. You can think about that as explored territory and unexplored territory. That's a good way of conceptualizing it. And that's the world that you're adapted to. It's the world really is explored territory and unexplored territory. And your left hemisphere functions in the domain of explored territory, and your right hemisphere functions in the domain of unexplored territory. And most of what that means is you don't like it when your right hemisphere turns on, because unexplored territory is the place where things exist that can eat you. And maybe you go to a horror movie now and then to just flirt with having your right hemisphere turned on, just to see what that's kind of like, so that you can experiment with it and you can explore it, and maybe you can fortify yourself to some degree, because that's what people do when they go see thrillers. Or it's strange. So why the hell would you go see a thriller and sit there like this, like, and pay? Here's $20. Why don't you just scare the hell out of me for 2 hours? Right? But people will do that. People do that, and that's because they're doing what I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, is they're toying with their own vulnerability, right? And they're attempting to master it, and that's what we're doing when we're watching narratives of adventure and horror, is we're playing with our vulnerability. We do that on roller coasters. We do that whenever we push ourselves to the edge and flirt with catastrophe. We're toying with our vulnerability. We're also toying with we're toying with our ability to move out into uncharted territory and to prevail. And here's a thought. You might want to stay in explored territory because that's where it's safe. But the problem with that is that explored territory is surrounded by unexplored territory where it isn't safe. And you can't just run out there naked, because then, like, a dragon will eat you, and that will be the end of that. That's a foolish strategy. But if you really want to prepare yourself for the world, you don't just stay where you're comfortable. You stay where you're comfortable enough so that you're not going to die, but you put one foot out where you don't understand, and then you balance yourself there, and you stay there as much as you possibly can. And that's actually what meaning is. And I think we know enough about brain function to actually say that the sense of meaning that envelops you when you're occupied property in your life is a neurophysiological signal that you have the fundamental constituent elements of reality in proper balance. And you think, well, why wouldn't that be the case? I mean, let's be hard-headed about it, right? We're not going to get all mythological and religious about this unless we have to. We're going to stay in the firm materialistic domain. It's like you're an evolved creature. You're evolved for the actual world. The actual world is made up of things you know and things you don't know, and a lot of the things you don't know are really dangerous. Now, you could stay where everything is comfortable. You could stay inside the walls, but that's not a very good strategy because the things that are outside the walls tend to come up inside the walls, right? That's the snake in the garden. That's why in paradise there's a snake. You think, well, God would make paradise a walled city, or a walled garden, which is what paradise means. What the hell is the snake doing there? And the answer is, there's no making a walled garden without a snake. And so what that means is that not only do you have to be able to live in the garden, you bloody well better be able to deal with the snakes. And what that means is that's what you should practice. And what that means is that you know that, and when you feel that things are aligned for you, when you're doing things that are meaningful and engaging, what that means is that you've got the balance between chaos and order right. And that means that you're secure at the same time that you're expanding your confidence. And then you might say, well, is that real? And the answer is, well, how about survival? Is that real? How about the expansion of the human capacity to survive? Is there anything more real than that? Well, not from a Darwinian perspective, there isn't. And it could easily be that there isn't anything more real than what's real from a Darwinian perspective. And so I would say that the sense of meaning is an unerring guide. And it's interesting, too. I mean, there's no shortage of religious speculation on the depth of meaning. I'll look at a particular symbol for the sake of illustration. So, for whatever reason, very mysterious reason, the image of the crucifixion has transfixed the imagination of humankind for 2,000 years. Now, it's not obvious why. In fact, it's by no means obvious why. I mean, it's a horrific symbol. And to put a symbol like that, which is the symbol of painful death and betrayal, something like that, to put that in cathedrals that took like 300 years to build. When medieval and Renaissance people in Europe were building cathedrals, they knew those things were going to take 300 years to build. It was like their moonshot, It was no joke. Those things took a lot of work and a lot of resources. And they're all built to encapsulate this symbol, this horrific symbol. It's like, well, what the hell's going on there? If you look at it from detached a bit, you think, well, there's a great mystery occurring there. And there's an idea, there's a deep idea there. And the idea is that the fundamental adaptive pattern is that which is expressed in the radical acceptance of vulnerability and malevolence. And that's what the crucifixion represents. That's what the passion story represents. And the reason it's an archetypal story, independent of its religious significance, I'm not speaking metaphysically here, I'm speaking as a psychologist, is that there's an idea, and the idea is that if you strip away everything from life, you're left with the fact of your vulnerability as a mortal being, and the fact of your subjugation to betrayal at the hands of yourself and others. Okay, the question is, what do you do with that? And the answer is, or the answer that's expressed by that symbol is, you accept it as radically and completely as you can, and the consequence of that is that you transcend it. And all of our cultural work that surrounds that symbol has been an attempt to bring that idea, that impossible idea, up into something resembling articulated consciousness. And we spent all those thousands of years toying with that symbol or being possessed by that symbol in an attempt to try to actually understand what it means. And that's what it means. It means that your best bet is to accept the crucifying preconditions of existence and to move forward uphill towards the best thing that you can envision, regardless. And I think that's true. I do believe that a truer idea than that has never been expressed. And it's expressed in other manners than in the Christian manner. I'm using that because it's such a well-known representation. It's still something that that's part of our culture now so that everyone has familiarity with it. But you see those sorts of ideas expressed in great stories, all from traditions all over the world. And it's a story of radical heroism, I would say, and radical courage. And that's the courage to dare to live properly in the world with your eyes open. You know, sometimes you see people who are naive, and they look like good people because they're not doing anything wrong. They don't even have any conception that wrong things might be possible. You know, they're like little kids. And so to be good under those conditions, in some sense, is to be nothing but to be unconscious. You know, you're not a good person until you know that you cannot be a good person, and maybe until you've actually practiced not being a good person a fair bit, so that you've got some teeth. And then you decide that, despite the fundamental brutality of the world, that you're going to act as an agent in the world who is devoted at every level that's possible towards making things better instead of making things worse. People that ask me whether or not I believe in God, which it's a question I really don't like. First of all, I think it's none of your damn business. Well, what do you mean by that exactly? And the third thing I think is, why do you think that what you mean by that is the same thing that I mean by that? And then the next thing I think is, what sort of trap are you setting for me exactly? What makes you think, yeah, well, you all laugh about that, right? Because that's very interesting, that response, because the trap in that statement is it's there. It's not obvious exactly what it is. It's got to be something like, well, here's a formulaic question, do you believe in God? And here's a set of potential formulaic answers. And if you utter one of those formulaic answers, here's a box I can put you in so I can ignore you and walk away. It's something like that. And so I was thinking about that. But then there's always the possibility that I'm not answering it because I'm confused or I'm cowardly. You know, those are also possibilities. Well, you need to be taken seriously, right? Because who knows? You know, I am confused about many things, and no doubt I'm cowardly about some things too. So it's certainly possible that that's a contributing factor. So, you know, I've been wrestling with how to formulate an answer to that question, well, for a very long period of time. Part of me thinks, well, if you want to know the answer to that, if you actually want to know, then I have a lecture series on maps and meaning that's 40 hours long, and you can listen to that because a question that large actually requires it's actually 52 hours. If you think of the book that I just recorded, it's like, if you want an answer to that question, then here's a 52-hour answer. Because if you're going to ask a question that's serious, then maybe you want to have a serious answer. And the serious answer isn't one sentence. But I was thinking about that today, and I think I have a better answer than that in some sense. And I think I just outlined it a little bit in this discussion that we've already had. And so part of that is, well, okay, so let's say it's a question of faith. And what you might put your faith in. And let's say you have to put your faith in something because you don't know everything, and so you need a starting point. And I think that's actually technically true. Because you're fundamentally ignorant, because you don't know everything, then you have to act as if some things are fundamentally true, or you just can't do anything, right? And I think that's technically true. And so then the question might be, well, what if you have to believe that some things are fundamentally true in order to exist at all in the world, even to see things, let alone act, then what are the things that you should act as if are fundamentally true? And I would say, well, I think the attitude that I laid out with regards to my 3-year-old son is a good example of that. I mean, you might start by hypothesizing that the fact that people exist is a good thing rather than a bad thing. And, you know, you might think, well, that's obvious. It's not that obvious. I just had a debate about a month and a half ago with a philosopher from South Africa named Peterson. And he wrote a book, the title of which I can't remember at the moment, unfortunately. But his basic presupposition, and he lays this out quite carefully, and has a very large number of followers, by the way, is that life is so absolutely, catastrophically, horrific and miserable that it would be better if nothing conscious at all existed. And you know, you think that's pretty dismal philosophy, right? But he actually thinks that it's a worse moral evil to bring someone into the world than not to. And you know, you have to take that sort of argument with a certain degree of seriousness, because, well, I know that when women are thinking about having children and decide not to, sometimes the reason they decide not to, the express reason, is that they don't want to bring a child into a world like this. And it's usually because they have some misapprehension that now is worse than at any other time in history, which is so absolutely not true that it's you know, just a miracle that you can think that, because things are way better now than they used to be. But it's still a serious question, you know, because you know, if you have any sense that if you bring someone into the world, that they're going to suffer and die at minimum, and perhaps maybe that's not something you should do if you were an enlightened creature. Let everything vanish, because being itself requires so much suffering that it's actually not worth the cost. And fair enough. And I've thought about that. Now, what I've realized, I think, is that there's two things wrong with that line of argumentation. One is that if you accept it, you don't stop there. You can't just say, well, I think being is unjustifiable, and so we shouldn't have any more beings. The argument doesn't stop there. The argument gets to be, well, I think being is unjustifiable because of its suffering, and that makes me bitter and angry, and then that makes me vengeful and destructive, and then I start to take my revenge out on the world. And so when you look at the motivation of people who do truly terrible things in the world, they start with the presupposition that being is intrinsically bad, and that their proper role is to do something to take revenge about that. And that seems like a bad idea, because if being is intrinsically bad, making it a hell of a lot worse because of what you're doing is not a solution. So I think that we can put that aside and properly. But then I would also say that the problem with that line of argumentation is that it actually does seriously underestimate the facts at hand with regards to the absolute grandeur of the human spirit. Because I do think that life is tragic and tainted by malevolence, but that if you look at the facts of the matter, metaphysical and rational, that human beings are so remarkable that they can actually contend with that and make it work. And so I would say, as I said, the fact that you guys all get the hell out of bed in the morning, despite, you know, there's lots of people in this audience who are carrying some pretty vicious burdens, you know. Maybe you're ill yourself in 1 or 2 or 10 different ways, you know, because lots of people have ill health. And if you're not ill, you will be. So, but if you're not, well, that's something to look forward to, eh? So, yeah, but if you're not ill, the probability that you have a first-degree relative who's got something fairly serious wrong with them is pretty damn high. And if you happen to be in one of those periods of life where that isn't happening, well, thank God for that, and you know, more power to you. And I hope you're happy, because you better be, because you know, make hay while the sun shines. But it's just around the corner for you. And still, despite that fact, you get the hell up and you go to work, and most of you are completely miserable wretches who are trying to make everything worse as a consequence. And so, like, way to be, because you have a reason to be. Well, I mean that, you know, like, if you go into a little shop or a little diner, say, and you go there and you get a decent cup of coffee, and you get a fresh glass of orange juice, and you get some eggs that aren't burnt on one side and raw on the top, you know, the person's put a little effort into it. It means that they've managed to transcend the tragedy of their existence well enough to deliver you something that isn't a little slice of hell. And I think those everyday acts of mundane heroism go unnoticed, and I don't think they should go unnoticed. And I think that if you understand the existential burden that people truly bear, if you open your eyes to that, and you see them through the symbolic lens of voluntarily accepted suffering, something like that, then the fact that someone is pleasant to you when you go to the diner in the morning and ask for a cup of coffee and deliver you a decent meal is actually a small miracle. And I really think that is the case. And I also think that that's an antidote to the sorts of toxic ideas that we bandied about in our society far too easily, like the fact that the planet would be better off if there weren't so many people on it, which I think is exactly the wrong sort of philosophy that you would want anyone whose hand was near the nuclear button to have, for example, or that we're somehow a cancer on the face of the planet and that our very existence is an indication of our toxicity because of all the damage we do. It's like, we can have a little sympathy for ourselves. You know, we're the only self-conscious creatures on Earth, and we struggle forward under incredible psychological distress that's built right into the fabric of our being. And given that fundamental level of brutality and suffering, we do pretty damn well. And a lot of us are actually pretty decent people, you know, and we're doing everything we can, I would say, as flawed creatures to make things better rather than worse. And you can tell that because, well, I told you about Seattle. I came here today. It's like, this is a pretty nice place. You know, you've got a lot of trees. You haven't killed them all. You know, you seem to like trees, and they're everywhere. So that's kind of green, and the air is pretty clear. And you know, the air in most of our cities, especially in North America and Europe, is way clearer than it was 50 years ago. So we've done a pretty decent job of cleaning things up. You know, way better than we will if you listen to the people who are all doom and gloom about the structure of the planet. And, you know, the water's not so filthy, and that's a positive thing. And most of you have indoor plumbing, and hey, there's something to be happy about. You know, if the heat works and the lights are on, and you know, you can go up the street, no one kills you, it takes your wallet. I'm always happy when I go outside, no one kills me, it takes my wallet. Hey, you know, because pessimistic as I am, I kind of think about that as the baseline condition of human interaction. And I really think about history. And if you know how easily societies can degenerate into absolute bloody mayhem, and how often that happens, the fact that you can go out like half stoned out of your mind and drinking too much microphone and Red Bull, and you can stop down at 3 in the morning and no dog kills you. It's like, hey, that's pretty good. It's a nice society. I'm not going to get to rule 12. So, you know, that's another thing that having this tragic outlook on life is actually real useful for, I think, because, you know, if what you expect is mayhem and catastrophe, which is what you should expect given how fragile you are and how fragile systems are in general, then every moment where that isn't happening is actually it's a miraculous testament to the triumph of the human spirit. And one of the things I would say is we've got that happening pretty decently in the West. Like, our societies are pretty damn civilized. You know, and I know they have their flaws, and resources are distributed unequally, and that obviously causes a certain amount of trouble, but it could be a hell of a lot worse than it is. And we're pretty damn fortunate that things are good, and I would say we could take a certain amount of credit for that, because the reason they're good is because most of you are pretty damn honest and trustworthy. And so, how the hell that happened, I have no idea. I really don't, because, you know, you see around the world and in history, there's so many corrupt states. And once a society is corrupt at the state level and at the individual level, and the baseline interaction between people isn't predicated on trust, it's virtually impossible to figure out how the hell that ever gets going. You know, because if you can't trust anyone around you, then how do you start trusting people? It's just something that doesn't seem to ever get off the ground. And yet, the default interaction in the West, and increasingly, I would say, in the rest of the world, the default interaction in the world is actually one of trust. I can give you an example of this. This is a small miracle, I think. I think I tell this story. I think it was in a chapter I cut out of 12 Rules. But it'll be in the next book, I think. So, not because it's a lesser chapter, but I lent my car to my graduate student about 20 years ago, and he drove to Montreal in the car. It was an old Cadillac, and he hit this torrential rainstorm and hit the brakes and smacked the car into a cement wall. And right on the corner, you know, the front corner, it's a bad place to have a dent because it takes out the bumper and the front quarter panel and, you know, the closey thing. Homer Simpson. So, anyways, he brought the car back, and he was all embarrassed about it, and I still give him a rough time about it, because why not? And, I decided to get the car fixed, so I took it to a mechanic, and he gave me some insane estimate that was like worth more than the car, and I thought, well, I can't do that, and so I went online, because you can now, if you want to fix your car, you can go online and you can describe the part, and then junk dealers all over North America will bid on the right to sell you the part and then ship it to you. Pretty good deal. So I put the part in and waited, and this guy from Mississippi got back to me, and he said, I have that part. And so we communicated by email a little bit, and he said he wanted some ridiculously low price for it, like $150 for the whole front end assembly, and he was going to ship it and charge me for that. I thought, well, that's a good deal, and I could find something to put it in. So that was fine, and I gave him my phone number, and about half an hour later he called me and said, look, I just went out to the yard, and I found out that that part that I was going to sell you, there's a plastic piece on the side, and it has a scratch in it. And I thought, wow, that's so amazing. It's like, you're a junk dealer in Mississippi, and I'm never going to see you again. You don't know who the hell I am. And you already gave me a really good deal on this part, and yet you called me up to tell me that it was scratched. And I thought, well, thank you, that's very good of you. It really is very good of you. And I said, that's okay, send it in, please. Scratch or no scratch. Thanks for telling me. And then he called me again about 15 minutes later, and he said, wait a sec, did you want the bumper or the whole bumper assembly with the lights and everything? And I said, well, I specified that in my original request. I wanted the whole assembly. He said, oh, well, the price I quoted you was just for the bare shell. He said, but look, because we already made the deal, I'll honor it. And I thought, that's why our damn civilization works. And I'm really serious about it. I always hear people talk about natural resources. There's a great book I read a while back called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, not the Adam Smith version. And I think it was Adam Smith, I think. Anyways, it doesn't matter. It was written by a Harvard emeritus professor. And he was trying to figure out why some cultures are rich and other cultures are poor. And he did an interesting analysis. He compared Western Hemisphere countries that were settled by Portugal, Spain, and France with Western Hemisphere countries that were settled by England. And what he basically found was that because of the English common law structure and the traditions that went along with it, if you were settled by England, then you were rich. If you were settled by the other countries, then you tended to be poor. And he tried to boil that down and understand why. His basic conclusion was countries governed by English common law tradition produced individual interactions that were fundamentally predicated on trust, and that's what made people rich. And he also analyzed Japan. And Japan's a very interesting society because they have no natural resources, right? All they have is like rocks and rice. And the rice they have to subsidize because they don't even really have rice because it's too expensive to grow there. So they really have nothing. But they do have interpersonal trust. Their society is very stable in that regard, and so they're very rich because of that. And so his conclusion, unfortunately I can't remember his name, but it might come to me, was that the only genuine natural resource was honesty and trust. And that's really something to think about, man. And I think there's something about that that's deeply, deeply true. So, okay, so back to the idea of meaning. It's like, well, you experience meaning in your life when you move beyond your domain of comfort into the unknown. And you do that because you're courageous enough to take on the burden of your own vulnerability and to expand your confidence despite that. And when you do that, then you're properly engaged with the world and you feel that your existence is worthwhile. And you feel that because you are, in fact, making yourself better in a way that's also making other things better at the same time. And that's a reliable marker. I said, well, what should you have faith in, let's say, in terms of your fundamental axioms? Well, you could start by positing that existence itself is good. You could start by, and you could say, I'm going to act like that. I'm going to act as if that's the case. Obviously, you can dispute that in a serious way, but if you go one way, then one set of consequences emerge, which is, I think, that the world gets better, and if you make the other decision, another set of consequences emerges, which is the world gets worse. So you could say, well, let's act as if being itself is justifiable, And then let's take the further step and act as if our proper role is to accept our own vulnerability and the malevolence of the world and work to eradicate it. And then, so if people, see, that would be my answer to the question whether or not I believe in God. I think that's the right way of answering it. It's like, well, I think that it's proper to act as if being is justifiable, and then our proper role within that being is to do everything we possibly can to make things as good as we can possibly make them. And then that's a faith that's acted out rather than a statement about a set of propositions. Do you believe in God? It's like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by believe exactly? Are you talking about adherence to a set of articulatable facts? It's like, that's not the deepest form of belief. The deepest form of belief, given my existential meaning, is what you act out. Right? It's what you act out. That's what you believe. And so there's some things to act out. Well, the alternative is to make everything worse. And maybe you think that's justifiable, but it's a bad idea. And that idea also in some sense fills me with hope, because I do believe that the human spirit is in some sense indomitable. And God only knows what we could make of what we've got if we all tried to make the very best of it. At the very least, I know that we could stop things from degenerating into the kind of absolutely catastrophic hells that we experienced in the 20th century. And that would be a lovely thing to avoid, even if we can't bring about paradise on earth, right? Even if we can't all work diligently towards the kingdom on the hill. We could make sure that we didn't slip backwards into the sorts of hell that characterized Nazi Germany and the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union. And that would be something. For me would be, well, all right, so we're going to accept that being is justifiable, partly by noticing that we actually love people despite their fragility, and so we've already made that judgment in a fundamental way. And we're going to act as if our proper role in life is to take the overwhelming weight of our own being on our shoulders and work to make things better regardless, which is a really noble pursuit, right? You know, because you might think, well, how is it possible, given your current dismal circumstances and wretchedness, that you could possibly have any regard for yourself, any esteem for yourself? I won't use self-esteem because I hate that phrase, but have any regard for yourself. And I would say, well, look, if you know that your fundamental conditions of existence are tragic, with a touch of malevolence just to make things that much worse, and that your eyes are open to that, you understand the catastrophic nature of that, and then despite that, you decide that your job is to wake up in the morning and to put things right, then maybe you could also say, well, you know, I'm not such a bad creature, all things considered, that I can take on that damnable load and still work with every fiber of my being to help myself and everyone else avoid the hell that might otherwise emerge. And so there's something that you can wake up to. And I do think that there's a nobility in that, a genuine nobility. I think it's the kind of nobility that allows you to justify your miserable existence in the world. And that's what you need. You don't need to be happy, because happiness is evanescent. It disappears because things fall apart on you. And if you're happy, good for you, and enjoy it. And I'm like, great. But it's not a boat that will get you through a storm, because as soon as there's a storm, you're not happy. And if happiness is what's keeping you afloat, then you sink. And that's not good, because the storms are always coming. And so what you need is something that will get you through the storm. And the idea that there's something about you that's noble enough to struggle uphill despite your unbearable load, it's like, yes, that's something you can take to the bank, man. And if you act that out in the world, you know, not only will you make your own life better, and that you'll make yourself stronger, and you'll improve your character, but you'll also make things better for your family, and you'll make things better for your society. And so that sense of meaning, this is something that's so cool, and I do also believe that this is true, is that the sense of meaning that orients you in relationship to the known and the unknown, right, also orients you towards the what would you call it, the stacking of different levels of being. So, in order for you to exist properly in the world, you can't just exist for yourself. You have to, because you don't just exist right now, let's say. You exist right now, and you exist next week, and you exist next month, next year. And so you have to act in the moment such that the probability that you will continue to exist and happen, let's say, at all those other time frames also simultaneously exists. So that means that you have to bind your action in the present by the necessity for your continued propagation across time. That's the discovery of the future, something that's very uniquely human. So you have to take into account your future self. And that's not very much different than taking into account other people. And you also have to do that. If you're going to exist now and in the future, you're going to have to exist in a way that makes other people want to exist around you, because otherwise things might fall apart really badly and you're done, you're gone. And so misbehaving in any fundamental way is a bad long-term survival strategy. So you might think, well, to act properly, you have to act properly now, and with regards to the multitude of your future selves, that's something like delay of gratification, I would say, or sacrifice for the future. And you have to act in a way that also benefits your family and that also benefits your community. And I would also say that's the riposte to postmodern nihilism and the claim that there's no such thing as a fundamental narrative. It's like the postmodernist claim is something like, the world is so complicated that there's an infinite number of ways you can interpret it. And that actually happens to be true. The world is so complicated, it isn't even obvious how we can see it, technically. Like our vision is a real mystery. But the fact that there's an indefinite number of ways of potentially interpreting the world does not for a moment imply that there's an indefinite number of valid ways of existing in the world. And when you think about the constraints that are put on your existence, then you can see that the proper ways of existing in the world start to shrink to a very, very small range, let's say. I really like the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I've talked a fair bit about his ideas, and so some of you might have heard some of the things I've said about Piaget before, but what I really like about Piaget in part was his analysis of children's games. Children's games are a microcosm of society, which is why children like games, because they have to learn how to act in society, so they generate toy societies, which is what you do when you play video games or go see a movie, by the way. You generate a toy society, and then you practice acting in it. And the toy society has it has the same structure as real society, except at lower resolution. And that's what children are doing. That's why you should leave them the hell alone when they're playing, because they're actually practicing learning how to exist. And so it isn't trivial. The fact that they're enjoying it is beside the point. It's just, that's an indication that they're following the instinctive path of meaning, let's say. And so they're practicing being in the world. And so it would be a good thing, for example, if our schools let children play a lot more than they do let them play. Recess for liability reasons, which is something that's happened almost everywhere, which is so appalling, it's almost unutterable. So Piaget was very interested in what made a good game, and he laid out some rules. A good game is one that you can play iteratively, and that's a good thing to know if you're going to marry someone, because you're going to play the same game every day for like 5,000 iterations, right? Well, that's exactly, so there's a little coda that goes along with that, by the way. It's something to think about too, is, because a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the exceptional things they do in their life, like the vacations they take and so forth, are the important things in their life. And that's just absolutely not true. The things you do every day are the important things. And so those mundane things, a client, I'll get back to the game thing, but I had a client who was spending about 45 minutes, this is sort of related to Rule 5, which I said I wasn't going to talk about. Don't let your children do anything that make you dislike them. He was spending about 45 minutes a night fighting with his son to try to get him to go to bed. And so I knew that parents actually only spend, on average, about 20 minutes a day with their little kids, like in direct one-on-one contact. They're around them, but direct one-on-one contact, it's vanishing in a small proportion of the time. And so you're spending 45 minutes a night fighting with your kid. It's like, that's twice as much time as you would normally spend with them. And if you think that that's going to end well, then you're not thinking about it. And so we thought about it. People don't like it when I do this because people don't like arithmetic. But we did a little bit of arithmetic. So figure 45 minutes a day is about 5 hours a week. Okay? And so that's about 20 hours a month. So that's half a work week a month. And so if you multiply that by 12, then that's 6 work weeks a year, a month and a half of work weeks. So basically, he was spending a month and a half of work weeks a year fighting with his son. It's like, that's not a good game, right? That's not a game anyone's going to win. And so, but it's interesting to do that arithmetic with regards to the things that you repeat every day, because you sort of learn exactly what your life is made of, and your life is made up of those things that you repeat. And so what you want to do is get those mundane things that you repeat pristine, which is why I've got that little trope that you were all laughing about cleaning up your room. It's like, well, you live in the damn thing. It's like, why not put it in order? Maybe even go the next step and make it beautiful if you can manage that. And it's, well, it's just my room. It's like, well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it's the microcosm of being that you have at hand. And if it's a mess, then it's like, well, what the hell are you up to exactly? You can't even manage that. That's pretty pathetic. You know? And you think, well, you know, it's beneath me. Oh, really, is it? Okay, well, fine. You know, so if someone gives you a whole country to rule, well, you pull up your socks and get your act together and nail that stuff. It's just your damn rule. Okay, so back to the game. What Piaget noted with children was that if you're going to set up a good game, then everybody has to want to play it. You have to be able to play it over and over, but everybody has to want to play it. That's the definition of a good game. It's so cool because Piaget was actually trying to reconcile the distinction between science and religion. That was what was driving him throughout his entire intellectual life. And he was trying to understand the evolution of morality. And one of his observations was, well, children spontaneously play, and their games tend towards playable games. And a playable game is one where everyone is treated with a certain amount of respect as a valid player, and everyone actually wants to play the game, so it's voluntary. And that's a really good definition of a free society. It's like, well, you get to play, and you get to play, and you both want to play, and if it's set up, you can't think of a better game, and so away you go. And so that's another indication of the fact that there's something about a fundamental ethic that isn't just arbitrary. And this is a very important thing to get right, I would say, in the 21st century, because one of the things that we kept claiming in the 20th century was that any old arbitrary game will do. They're all equally arbitrary. It doesn't matter if they're Marxist or capitalist. It's all equally arbitrary. It's like, no, that's wrong. That's seriously wrong. The scientific data are in. The philosophical data are in. The narrative is in. There's a very constrained number of ways that we can orient ourselves in the world. And they boil down to, I would say, a set of fundamental ethical axioms. But one of them is that the individual is sovereign and paramount, and that everybody has intrinsic value, and that you set up your societies with that as the fundamental axiom, and then it works. So I think the moral relativism claim, it's like, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's wrong. And you know, if you're not convinced of that, because you might not be, and perhaps you shouldn't be, you might also avail yourself of the relevant animal literature, because some of the most brilliant people whose work I've encountered, Franz de Waal, for example, who's a primatologist, and Jaak Panksepp, who was probably the world's foremost neuroscientist of emotions, both studied the emergence of morality in rats, that was Panksepp, and in chimpanzees, that was de Waal, and demonstrated quite clearly with the chimps. It's particularly interesting that brutal chimp dominance hierarchies that are predicated only on power. So that would be the chimp patriarchy, right? That would be the Marxist view. I'm serious. I'm really serious about that. That would be the chimp patriarchy. That's the view of the world. Every hierarchy is brutal and it's dominated by a tyrant. And and those who climb to the top do that because they're tyrannical. De Waal demonstrated quite clearly that those hierarchies, even among chimps, are very unstable, and the people and the chimps who run them are very likely to meet an extraordinarily violent end. And so he showed that form of hierarchical organization was radically unstable. And it's not surprising, right? Because even chimps don't like to be tyrannized. So, and they will rebel eventually as a consequence. And so you can see this emergent ethic far below the level of the human. And Jaak Panksepp, and this is something, he should have won a Nobel Prize, that guy. He was an absolute genius. He was the person who identified the play circuit in mammals. That's a big deal. They have to find that, you know, that our capacity for play is actually a consequence of a separate biological system. That's a major discovery. And he spent a lot of time studying play behavior among rats, rough and tumble play in particular, which is a very interesting field of endeavor because fathers tend to do a lot of rough and tumble play with their kids, and it seems to be one of the primary ways that human fathers socialize their children, and so it's very relevant. What Peterson found was that rats would work to earn the right to engage in rough and tumble play. And so that's how you tell if an animal is motivated. You see if it'll work for something. It's kind of the same way you figure out if a human being is motivated. And rats will work to enter an arena where they know they'll be able to wrestle with another rat, especially if they're young, juveniles, especially if they're juvenile males. And if you pair two rats together, and one of them is 10% bigger than the other, the big rat can stomp the hell out of the little rat consistently. And so then imagine you did your experiment, you just paired them once, and the big rat stomped the little rat, and you say, ha, dominance hierarchies are predicated on power. That'd be your conclusion. It's like, yeah, except you missed something. And what you missed is you don't play with someone once. You play with them over and over and over and over. And the rules that govern a game that continues across a large segment of time are not the same rules that govern a game you only play once. Because if you're playing, imagine you're not playing a game, you're playing a set of games. And then imagine that the rules for winning a set of games are not the same rules for winning one game. And then you don't care about winning one game if you have any sense, because you're not just going to play one game, you're going to play the set of games. And so then you want to know what the rules are that govern victory across the set of games. And I would also say that the reason that our religious presuppositions evolve, and this, you can think about this for about 5 years, this idea. The reason our religious presuppositions evolve is because we've been trying to formulate a picture of the proper action patterns that enable you to attain victory across the set of all possible games. And that's a very, very difficult thing to figure out. But you kind of know it. That's what you tell your kid when you say, doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. And the kid says, what do you mean by that? And you say, I don't know. But I know. The kid says, what do you mean? Why shouldn't I just go all no holds barred and do whatever I have to win? Because that's the point of the game. It's like, no, it's not. That's not the point of the game. The point of the game is to play the game in a manner that ensures that you're invited to play the maximum number of games with everyone in the future. That's the point, right? And so part of that is try and win each game. But so that's one level of morality. Try to win each game. But there's a level of morality above that, is try to win each game in a manner that ensures that everyone wants to keep playing with you, because then you'll never run out of people to play with your entire life. And that's way better. And that is what you're telling your son or your daughter when you say it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. And you wouldn't know that except for the fact that people have struggled to make that conception conscious for tens of thousands of years while attempting to grapple with the fact that we iterate our processes across time. And so we've built pictures of what your attitude in life has to be like if you're going to be the person who wins, who has a good chance at winning who has a good chance of winning across the broadest possible set of circumstances. That might mean that you, with rats, and this is back to the Peterson issue, Peterson found that if you paired the rats together, once the big rat had established dominance, then it was up to the little rat to invite him to play. So the next time you put the rats together, the little rat would come out, you know how dogs sort of bounce when they want to play? They kind of put the rear end of it in the air, and they put their paws down, and they bounce around, and they say, come on, primate, like everyone knows this language. And so, and if you have a clue, you kind of, you smack the dog a little bit, and you pretend you're angry at him, and he pretends to bite you. If he's a good dog, he actually doesn't bite you. And if you're a good person, you actually don't smack him. Right? Even dogs have got this down. And so the little rat, that's why we can get along with them. So the little rat comes bounding out and, does this play invitation to the big rat, and then the big rat, who's kind of cool and, smoking away in the corner. Yeah, you're kind of, nondescript. And I stalked you once already, but yeah, okay, I'll come play. And so then he goes and plays, and if he doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat won't ask him to play anymore. And like I read that, it just blew me away. It's so unbelievably profound, because what it indicates is that, and then I think it emerges out of repeated voluntary play bouts. It's like, So that's where ethics comes from. I see. Well, that's something to discover, because we tend to think of ethics as something like an arbitrary, articulated code, you know. And it could be one thing. It could be Marxist. It could be capitalist. It could be any number of arbitrary sets of rules. It's like, no, it couldn't. Fair play isn't arbitrary. Even rats understand fair play. So the ethic is way deeper even than humanity itself. And so that's something that's very much worth knowing. So let me back up. Actually, we discussed one rule. But it's a good one. Do what is meaningful and know what is expedient. You know, imagine if it was the case, and I think it might be, that the world is made out of chaos and order. That's the landscape we inhabit. And that your job is to expand the domain of order by continually conquering the domain of chaos. And the way you do that is by having one foot in order where you're comfortable, and having one foot out in disorder and unknown where you're challenging yourself. And then imagine that you can tell when you're doing that right because you're engaged in what you're doing. That's the marker from the deepest levels of your being that you have the constituent elements of reality properly balanced. And then imagine that that's balanced in a way that doesn't just work for you, but works for you and your future selves, and works for you and your family and your community. Or perhaps even at levels of reality beyond that, all simultaneously. And that's why it is that it infuses you with that sense of engagement and meaning. That's highly possible. I think that's in accordance with the best evidence we have about how the brain actually functions. And so wouldn't that be something? What it would mean is that life is intrinsically meaningful. That you can rely on that sense of meaning to guide you. That sense of meaning will also help you transcend the tragedy of your own existence. It will help you encounter and defeat malevolence. It will help you set the world right. And furthermore, it will give you that sense of value for your own being that comes with knowing that you're hoisting the weight of your existence on your shoulders where it belongs and stumbling uphill towards the kingdom of God, so to speak, just like you should. I think that that's the fundamental story of the West, and I think that it's correct. And I think that it would be a lovely thing if we all woke up now in the 21st century and understood that consciously and did everything we possibly could to implement it and see what the hell happens. Because why not do it? And I think that that's a good place to stop. So, thank you very much.
This is actually Jordan's computer, and he's given me the password. I could end this whole thing tonight with one tweet. It could all come crashing down. I mean, how incredible is what this guy is doing? Like, really think about what you just heard for the last, hour and a half or so, and then think about what was on CNN for the last hour and a half. Talking about a porn star, people. That's what we're up against. My point is we're winning, and you guys are part of it. All right, should we bring him back out? This room feels like it's not on us or something. It's so cool to see the dog be stuck. like this, and people would be dressing up like lobsters.
Well, I didn't think that part at all. That's kind of a real shock. I mean, it's a funny thing because at one level I'm absolutely shell-shocked by, well, the fact that we're all here, for example. But
there was a lobster joke there.
Yeah. So, yeah. That's the Freudian slip, eh? So that's a good example of a Freudian slip. That's the right hemisphere inserting its own viewpoint into this straight of the left hemisphere. Really, that is why that happens. So I'm surprised at one level and not surprised at another. And the reason I'm not surprised is because, you know, the things that I've been discussing in my lectures, when I learned them, they just flattened me. You know, there's some things in Maps of Meaning, for example. I write a lot about ancient Egyptian mythology and ancient Mesopotamian mythology, and I think I cracked 2 old stories, and one of them is the oldest story that we know, the oldest written story. And when I finally understood what those stories meant, I never recovered from it, I would say. It was so absolutely overwhelming. And it's not surprising, you know, because these stories, the Mesopotamian story, the Enuma-Elish, and the Egyptian story, they actually emerged at the beginning of those, of the great period of those cultures. And the stories have that motive force that pushed the whole culture forward for thousands of years. And so if you kind of stumble across what the story means and you see the power in it, well, it's not surprising that it's obviously flat. And I've thought for decades that well, I always was amazed that I got to teach what I was teaching at universities. I thought it was just benign neglect that was enabling me to continue to function. And I thought I would never figured out that I was actually teaching it, like rugby off the campus, like on a rail. So it's not surprising that these stories have this kind of effect on people, because they are exactly the kinds of stories that do have this sort of effect on people. And so, you know, that was something I learned, I would say, particularly from reading Carl Jung, who was a genius of virtually incalculable proportions, whose works stagger me every time I dip my fingers back into them. So I pulled on that. It's like, yes, it's a terrible shock, but by the same token, it's like, we live within a great story, and we need to have it retold generation after generation. It's absolutely necessary. And so this is a manifestation of that, I think. We'll see.
We shall see. Well, I think the reaction that we're getting, that you're getting, I think we are seeing right now. So we got a ton of questions here. I put them in some sort of order. I think this is probably the most important one. When will you be doing a duet with Kanye West?
Yeah, I think that's probably when health freezes over.
If you had to do a duet with somebody, who would it be? You've been talking about music a little bit when we've done some of these Q&As.
God, you know what the name of the book is? This is so ridiculous. The name of the book in my mind was Dean Martin. What the hell?
You could have also said Kermit the Frog.
Oh, yes. That's great.
Somebody's got to make a meme out. All right, here we go. This is sort of interesting. Why do humans think gemstones are beautiful?
Yeah, that is good. That is a good one. Carl Jung actually wrote a fair bit about that, interestingly enough. So the first thing about a gemstone is that it reflects light, right? And light is a symbol of illumination and enlightenment, and it's associated with consciousness. And it's associated with the idea, the old archetypal idea, that the sun hero, I mean, the heavenly Lord, the sun hero, is the deity that confronts the dragon of darkness at night and battles its way through that and rises victorious in the morning. And so that's part of the connotation of the idea of light. And to have something that reflects light is to have something that partakes of that heavenly process that's simultaneously earthly. And so, but then there's another level of analysis that's really interesting. This is why Iron Man, for example, in the Avengers movies, basically has a crystal that keeps him alive, because he's in the process of alchemical transformation towards gold. It's part of the mythological substructure of that story. Like a crystal, a pure crystal is a very, very interesting material object, because pure crystal, like a diamond, is exactly the same at every level of analysis, right? All of the molecules in that, all of the atoms in a crystal like a diamond are lined up perfectly. Everything, so it's one thing, and that's why it's so hard. And it's the fact that it's one thing that makes it reflect light. And so there's a synchronistic relationship between the purity and the hardness of the stone and its ability to reflect illumination, and the implication of that for a human being, because what you want to do is confront heat and pressure in your own life to transform yourself into something that's one thing at every possible level, and then you also reflect light. And that's also, metaphorically speaking, and that's something that's all symbolized by a gemstone. And that gives you an example of how deep we are, you know, because, well, you like sparkly things, you know. That's where it's sparkles. It's like, yeah, you know, there's a reason that those things are regarded as valuable. And you think, what, it's just some arbitrary reason? It's not arbitrary. People put a lot of work into finding gemstones and polishing them and cutting them and giving them to people they love as a symbol of permanence. And you don't want to make light of that, so to speak. So,
you're a blunt machine.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's part of the answer to that question. It's the same reason that you put lights on a Christmas tree in the middle of winter, right? To celebrate the idea of illumination, to celebrate the idea of light and darkness, to celebrate the idea of the return of the light in the darkness of winter, to associate the idea of the return of light in the darkness of winter with the birth of the redeeming hero, which is the archetypal model for the person who bears their own vulnerability and then confronts the world and improves it. And so all of that is stacked up in those ritualistic behaviors that you undertake. And it's so fascinating to see that that's the case. So we act out things. If we have levels of wisdom that we don't understand, which is to say that we're more complicated than we know, obviously. That's obviously the case. And we act out things, we even represent things that we don't understand. You know, we go see movies like, we go watch Harry Potter, for example. Real phenomenon, right? I mean, the woman who wrote Harry Potter, Rowling, she got 10-year-old kids to read 7 600-page books. Right? And then she could go to the stadiums and they would all come and listen to her tell stories. And then it was a multi-billion-dollar empire, right? That not only a book publishing phenomenon, but a movie empire. She generated untold wealth as a consequence of telling these stories. And what was the story she told? She told the story of an orphan hero who was willing to die and be born to defeat evil. That's the Harry Potter story. It's like, well, have you ever heard that story before? Yeah, I've heard that story before. So when the formal incarnation of that story recedes into the background, we just say what's happening with Christianity, and then new mythological representations of the same idea are going to make themselves manifest in the collective imagination. That's exactly what's happening. That's why you're all watching superhero movies too. It's the same thing. The religion collapses. It can't collapse. The narrative substrate cannot collapse, not without everything falling. And so luckily it has enough power to rejuvenate itself in all sorts of surprising ways. You know, so you get all these atheistic engineering types who, you know, sneer at the idea of the great deity in the sky who watch their bloody superheroes and marvel without noticing that they're engaged in an act of worship and paying for the privilege of doing so.
What would it look like if that narrative actually collapsed?
Oh, well, it collapses into something. And this is the predictions of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky at the beginning of the 20th century. They both, because they were wise beyond repair and really wise beyond understanding. So Nietzsche predicted by about 1850 that because of the collapse of our fundamental narrative substructure, he described that as the death of God, which was not something he celebrated, by the way. He said, God is dead, we have killed him, essentially, and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's hardly a triumphant statement. He predicted that the 20th century would be a battleground of nihilism and totalitarianism, and hundreds of millions of people would die as a consequence. So not bad for 1850 prediction. So when Dostoevsky did exactly the same thing, he laid that out in the Devils that possessed, and where he described the sort of character would eventually run the Russian Revolution. And so you lose your narrative. People to differentiate into their tribal communities, that's complete hell. Or people lose faith in life and become nihilistic, and look out for that. Nihilism generates fascism, essentially, as well as being, making people depressed and anxious and miserable and bitter and resentful and cruel and murderous and genocidal, in a succession. It's not a good thing. Even we know this neurologically. There's a great book called Master and His Emissary, which is a book about hemispheric function. And it's quite obvious that our conditional cognitive systems, our explicit systems of belief, are nested in a metaphorical narrative that's basically our right hemisphere function. And you can't lose that. It's what orients you in the world. If you lose that, you're lost. And that's why, one of the ideas that I've been describing is the notion that one of your responsibilities is to rescue your dead father from the belly of a whale. You watch that in Pinocchio, right? You think about how strange that is. I imagine 90% of you in this audience have watched Pinocchio and not noticed what the hell you were doing while you were watching drawings of a puppet follow a cricket into a whale. Well, that makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, they're being resurrected by a fairy. It's like, why don't you look at what you'll swallow? It's just absolutely beyond belief. You don't even notice. It's like, and then it even makes sense. Well, that's where it makes sense. No, it didn't. It didn't make any sense at all. Right? And so, but the idea that you have to rescue your dead father, that's a really old idea. Right? That goes all the way, in explicit form, that goes all the way to ancient Egypt and farther back than that. And there's an idea that you can conceive of your culture as the corpse of your ancestors. That's a way of thinking about it. Because it was produced by people who are no longer. It was produced by the dead. And there's a spirit that animates it. And it's necessary for you, because you're a historical creature and you live within a historical structure, it's necessary for you to revitalize the spirit of that history in order to live properly. You can't live properly without it because you actually are a historical creature. And so every generation, it's the ethical responsibility of every generation to go into the underworld, which is to face the things that you're most afraid of, which is the fire-breathing dragon. Because I'll tell you something else strange about Pinocchio is the whale is a fire-breathing dragon. Remember what happens, he lights a fire inside, and the whale turns into a fire-breathing dragon. And it's out of the belly of the dragon that Pinocchio raises his father. And there's a choice, actually, in the movie as well, where Pinocchio is dragged Geppetto out of the whale to their own peril. And Geppetto is in danger of permanently dying and drowning. And Geppetto says to him, just let me drown and save yourself. And Pinocchio doesn't, and as a consequence, he washes up dead on the beach. That's a death and resurrection scene. And the idea is that, well, the attempt to resurrect your dead father from the belly of the underworld it's a terrible undertaking. It's a horrific undertaking, but it's absolutely necessary. And it's part of the ethical requirement of being human. And so that's another example of how these archetypal ideas always play themselves out. So you have to tie yourself back into the past. You have to resurrect the spirit of your traditions, because otherwise you're lost. And the problem with being lost is it will make you bitter. That's the first thing. And the second is that it will make you susceptible to second-rate religious structures and forms of ideologies. Because you're not going to live, you're either going to be lost, and that means you live without a narrative, or if you don't have a fundamental narrative, like a really fundamental, solid, deep, archetypally structured narrative, you're going to be a sucker for the first person who comes along with a half-wit ideology. And that's called getting a university education.
Why did you grow the beard, Peterson? It was because of me, right?
Who the hell knows? It's something I do sometimes. Now that I have a beard, sometimes I don't. I mean, my wife likes it, so I have to live with her. So maybe she likes it. My Well, what I've done, now and then I get impulsive and I respond in a kind of impulsive manner on Twitter, which is a bad idea, right? Especially, I'm especially susceptible to that when I'm tired at the end of the day. So another thing not to do is to read Twitter replies at the end of the day. That's a bad idea. You should watch and wait until you know what the right thing is to say. That's what you should generally do anyways. And if you don't have the right thing to say, then you should just wait. But one of the things I've learned that's perhaps a little deeper than that is that, because there's a deeper question there, which is what you should do when people attack you. And one answer, which I lay out in rule number 5 about kids, is you always use the minimum necessary force to defend yourself. That's a basic rule of English common law. You have the right to use the minimum necessary force to defend yourself. And that's a hell of a fine principle, because why would you use any more force than that? All you do is produce counterproductive consequences. And I think the reason, and this has really served me well in many situations, because the situations where I kept my head when things got uncomfortable, like in the student demonstrations, and some of those were damn uncomfortable, and there was some pretty severely, there were some people in those demonstrations, not most of them, but there was a small minority of people who attended those demonstrations that were definitely aiming at making the world a hell of a lot worse. And I can kind of pick those people out in mob, and they're not the sort of people that you want to have within arm's reach of you. But the right response is to react in the minimum possible way and still hold your ground. And what's happened as a consequence of implementing that, as far as I can tell, is that every time I've been attacked in that manner in public, the consequence of that has ended up being good for me. And so that's pretty interesting. I mean, that Kathy Newman interview was a good example of that. It wasn't that hard, actually, because we got absurd so rapidly. It was like, I kept thinking, I don't know who the hell you think you're talking to, but it's certainly not me. Watching that, someone it was like watching someone interview a figment of their imagination. I kept having to say, I don't know who you're talking to, but I'm here and we're trying to have a conversation. But again, unfortunately, I didn't react except minimally, and that really worked. And so it's a good thing to learn to do if you can learn to do it. It's hard because there's part of you, especially if you're being attacked, that really wants to defeat completely. But you don't have to do that. You just have to hold your ground sufficiently. And so when you see hit pieces or when you experience that kind of pressure in your own life, then you want to stand your ground with minimum necessary force. And that's the most effective possible strategy as far as I can tell.
What about the other ones that you just described, the people that get that look? I was just showing you the thing that I did at the University of New Hampshire. Yeah. I saw that look.
Oh, yeah.
It truly is scary.
That's a tough one, man. I think there's only a generic answer to that question to some degree, which is that you try to conduct yourself in your life in a manner that's likely to generate the fewest number of those people possible. And so if there's any hope for someone who's seriously aiming down and aiming at destruction, or maybe vengeful destruction, the best possible antidote to that is probably example. Rational argumentation isn't going very far. But that's a very hard question because it's hard to defeat someone who has nothing to lose. So,
what advice do you have for young men whose fathers passed away while they were teens? How do they develop the masculine traits needed to become great men?
Well, you could say the spirit of the benevolent father is everywhere. You know, and so you can go to the university and you can choose your peers and mentors from the greatest people who ever lived. And so that's actually the proper substitute as you mature anyways, because at some point you have to not have your personal father. That's another reason why the religious notion of a man father detached from day-to-day reality is such an important idea, is because you need an ideal that transcends the familial. So you might say, well, it's incumbent on you to worship the spirit of the Father. Well, what do you mean by that psychologically? Well, that's like the great ancestral spirit. That's a pattern. That's the pattern that's generated civilization itself. And you can conceptualize that. It's very easy to conceptualize that as a paternal spirit. If you think of a spirit as something like a disembodied pattern, the spirit is something like, maybe more than that, but it's at least that. And so I would say, find your father elsewhere. And the way that you can do that, at least in part, is by looking at what you admire. Because that's another really interesting thing about people, and it's an interesting thing to view in yourself. If you notice how you react in the world, you notice that there are people or the actions of people that you admire. And it isn't like you're doing that voluntarily. It's like you just notice that that happens. Think, well, that's, in some sense, that's the instinct to worship. And again, I'm talking psychologically. If the instinct to worship is the instinct to imitate, which it is, and if the instinct to imitate is the instinct to learn, which it is, then the fact that you can be gripped by admiration is the way that your unconscious mind orients you towards good in the world. It grips you. That's how an archetype works. It's like, well, there's something in that I'm really fascinated by, right? I'm attracted by that. And I'll focus on that. And it isn't something you do voluntarily, it's something that happens to you. And you can also use that as a guide. It's like, Solzhenitsyn talks a lot about this, because he underwent a very profound psychological transformation when he spent time in the Gulag archipelago camps. And he said that what catalyzed his transformation was his observation of people who conducted themselves with impossible nobility under brutally difficult situations. He encountered people who could do that. And he tells, I would say, perhaps hundreds of stories of people like that he encountered when he was in the camps. And so he started to notice that those people existed and that there was something in him that was responding with the kind of admiration that whose incorporation enabled him to completely transform the way he looked at the world. And so that's the rediscovery of the Father. That's part of also the process of rescuing the Father from the belly of the whale. And you see, that's exactly what this questioner was asking. He says, well, my Father's dead, how do I resurrect him? That's the question that's at the bottom of that. It's like, well, you turn from the personal Father to the spiritual Father, so to speak, which is something you have to do if you mature anyways, because, or you lose the Spirit entirely, which is a bad thing. If you don't replace your personal Father with the transpersonal Father, then you never mature, because you're always under the thumb of your personal Father, who you essentially confuse psychologically with God. It's not helpful. And you see, if people are still under the thumbs of their Father when they're like 40 years old, the reason for that is that they haven't taken the pattern of the Spirit of the Father away from their Father and put it into the transcendent space where it belongs. And there's tremendous utility in doing that. And that's independent of the metaphysics of the Spirit of the Father. That's an in-depth, independent question. So that's what you need to do. You need to discover the Spirit elsewhere, and perhaps somewhere better. And there's something that's even more important that lurks at the bottom of that. And this is why I think that the idea of the psychological idea of the transcendent Father is not something that you want to dismantle casually, because, like, look, you know, you guys have a president, and of course the temptation of the president is to become king, and the temptation of the king is to become God. And that's not good, because the president isn't the king, and the king isn't God. And the reason for that, speaking psychologically, is because God is God, not the president. The president isn't God. And so then you think, well, what is God? God is the disembodiment of the idea of sovereign authority. It's the pattern disembodiment of the idea of supreme authority. So that supreme authority is extracted away from any carrier of that authority and made a principle, right? A transcendent principle. And then the president is subordinate to that transcendent principle. And that better be the case, because otherwise the temptation is president, king, God. And that's a very bad idea. You know, we know what happened again in the 20th century when secular leaders like Stalin or Mao or Hitler were basically elevated to the essential place of deity. It was like they weren't God, that's for sure. They were more like Satan ruling over hell. In fact, they were a lot like that. Really a lot. And perhaps even a lot more than you think. So that's a very complicated answer.
All right, we got two more. I feel this is a good follow-up to that. Do you ever smoke pot? Everyone put away your phones, let the man answer.
Yes, of course. Like, when I graduated from high school, that was 1979, that was the year that illicit drug use peaked in North America. So, yeah, I've been smoking pot since I was like 12. So, I'm like Bill Clinton, I actually inhale. Having said that, I should also say, you know, like, for me, pot isn't a particularly dangerous drug. For me, alcohol is a dangerous drug. But I've had friends that were pretty much destroyed by pot. And so, despite the fact that I smoke it, and also despite the fact that I think it should be legal, and also that it has certain advantages, I do also understand that it's not something that is without its risks. You know, and I have one friend in particular who I write about a fair bit in 12 Rules for Life, for whom smoking pot was probably the gateway to suicide. I mean, that was the whole story, but so, you know, I'm saying that I smoke pot, and I'm not saying, well, you know, that means that in some sense it's a free and easy and careless thing to do. It's everything has its risks, and psychedelics also have their risks, but they also have their advantages. So, and maybe it would be good if we were mature enough to, you know, take the advantages and carefully deal with the disadvantages.
So I'll throw in. Marketing back to one of the rules, which is do not lie. We paused for a moment there, because I think you have a lot of pressure on you that you don't want people, you don't want to just tell people to smoke pot or tell people to do this or that or the other thing.
I don't have to tell these people.
All right, forget that one then. All right, so then the last one that I saw there was, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
It's hard to say because I think that I took the advice that I gave my 20-year-old self. So, well, it was okay, fair enough. That's the only thing. Well, I realized when I was about that age, what I wrote about in Rule 6, which is put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You know, my family is cursed with an extremely severe form of depression, and I've suffered from depression on and off, probably since I was a kid. And my grandfather suffered from it, my father suffered from it, I had two aunts that suffered from it, and me and my daughter, it's brutal. I asked my daughter has arthritis, and she had 38 affected joints, which is a lot. And she deteriorated to the point where when she was 16, she had to have her hip and her ankle replaced after walking around with like 2 broken legs essentially for a year. It's brutal. And she also has this familial depression. And I asked her when that happened, if she could remove one of her illnesses, either the arthritis or the depression, which one would she remove? And she said she would keep the arthritis. And so that gives you some indication of what that depression is like. It's not good. And brutally hard on my father, who's quite a remarkable man. And anyways, and so that meant, there were times in my life where I was feeling pretty miserable about things. But what I realized was that there were a bunch of things that I was doing wrong, and that I could try to stop doing them and see what happened. Right? It was an experiment. And I thought, well, I know some things I'm doing wrong, those are just bloody obvious. And they're probably making my life worse than it has to be. And maybe there's 10 things that I'm really doing wrong and another 500 that I'm sort of doing wrong, and I can start not doing those and see what happens, to run that as an experiment. And I started doing that when I was probably about 23, just when I went to graduate school. I thought, okay, I'm going to see what would happen if I just stop doing all the things that I'm doing that are stupid, that I know are stupid. And it was the same time when I decided that it was a strange experience, and I detail out a little bit in Maps meeting in the intro. I was working in a maximum security prison, just very casually under the supervision of a very strange psychologist. And I was out.
You're gonna gloss over that?
Yeah. Exactly, right. That's for sure, yeah. And I mean, and I encountered some things there that really made me think hard. And one of the things they made me think about was be careful with what I was saying. And so at the same time that I decided that I was going to stop doing the stupid things I was doing that I knew that were making my life worse, I was going to stop saying things that I didn't believe to be true. And that was also extremely shocking, because I really made a vow that I would do that. Like, I really made a vow that I was going to do that, come hell or high water. And I meant that. I was going to stake myself on that. And, it was very uncanny, because over the 4 months following that decision, I came to realize that almost everything I said wasn't true. And 95% of it was for show, to impress people, things I had taken from books but really didn't deserve, things that I meant knowledge I could mimic but really didn't have. Just endless arrays of shallow and deep forms of self-deception. And I noticed that if I paid attention to what I was saying, I could tell when I was being false, because I felt weak when I was talking. And so what I tried to do was to only say things that didn't make me feel weak. And that was really a strange experience, because to begin with, almost everything I said made me weak. And I thought, oh my God, could it really be the case that almost everything I say is weak? And it was a shock, and I thought, well, there's kind of insanity in both ways. It's like, is it really the case that you're that false? Which of these things do you believe? Do you believe the sense of falseness and put up with the fact that 95% of what you're doing is false, or do you put up with the necessity of having to get rid of all of that? And I decided I'd get rid of all of it. And so that's been a good thing. That's been a really good thing. And I do think it's changed me almost completely. I mean, I'm still the same person, obviously, but in many ways not at all the same person. And so it's been very useful. It's also helped me write, because I've tried to pronounce a meaning in particular. I wrote every sentence in that book at least 25 times. And the way I would write it is I would write a sentence, and then I would write variants of the sentence, multiple variants, and if I could get a better sentence, then I would substitute it. And so, but I was also, I take the sentence and I try to think of every possible way that that sentence could possibly be wrong. And if I could think of any reason why it was wrong, any way I could get underneath it and pry it up, then I fixed it so I couldn't challenge it. And so that's what I did when I went through Maps meeting. And there's a 500-page book. There's a lot of sentences in that book, and that's why it took 15 years to write. The consequence of that was that I put bedrock underneath my feet. And that's never left me, even during these times that have been very difficult. The bedrock was still there. And so, also that's what I decided to do when I was, in my early 20s. So.
Well, unfortunately, we could go all night, but I think we're going to London tomorrow.
We are.
Yeah. Got a meeting with the Queen. I've been saying this to the end of all these, but my brother-in-law and sister-in-law are out here, and I was talking to them on the way here, and they were asking a little bit about I said, you know, for me, I feel like now I'm on this journey. It's what will come out of me at the end of this will be different than what went in, and I think that that's exactly
Well,
why
you
all
told
of
me
these.
tonight that you were gonna buy new suits, so there's.
Yes, I will start dressing better, because you really upped it in the clothing game. But I just love being on this adventure with you, and on that note, I'm gonna get out of the way, and guys, give it up.